Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and even if you don't have kids, this next thing I'm going to say is going to make perfect sense, because even if you're goofing around with somebody else's kids, this is just how it's done. Whether you're boxing or playing basketball or wrestling around or having a pillow fight or playing a board game, you do this thing intuitively when you're the grown-up in the equation where you're like, oh, nuts, you're beating me. This is really hard. You stack the deck against yourself on purpose. You don't do it so that you can show them up. You do it so that, they have a chance and it's fun. But in the Bible, we see this very oft repeated motif of God stacking the deck against himself, not to patronize the people who he's playing with. Does that analogy hold out? You know what I mean? He does it so that nobody else could possibly get credit for the incredible thing that just happened. And here in, a couple weeks or whatever, there are going to be some of you who are like, wait a minute. That was a podcast episode first, and now it's a video on your YouTube channel, because this is totally going to be a video on my YouTube channel. I've actually been working on it for quite a while, because I'm fascinated by this repeated pattern in the Bible of God setting up situations in such elaborate and contrived ways where the odds are so not overcomable that everybody, people who like him, people who don't like him, are going to look at the situation and be like, dang, there's something supernatural happened there. That must have been God. God is the only one who could ever possibly get credit for that. And so what I'm going to do in this little video that's coming up here in a few weeks or whatever is going to be, I'm just going to, break down a whole bunch of these examples and make like a top 5 or a top 10 list or something. But on the list, along with the really obvious stuff like David and Goliath, you pick this tiny little guy, you have him ditch all the armor, you have him arm himself with just little stones to fight against the most impressive warrior that is described anywhere in the whole Bible. You're stacking the deck against yourself. And here in Matthew chapter 14, with the feeding of the 5,000, it's a repetition of this motif that would have been very, very familiar to the original audience. They would have seen Jesus do this and get up there and be like, all right, we're going to feed all y'all. And we're going to do it with this one little lunch pail that we've got here, and it's going to work out. I think even right there in the moment, some of the people sitting in the crowd who are like, is this the Messiah? Is this God incarnate? They would have seen him do that. They would have been like, oh, I know this move. Kids, look at this. Look what he's doing. That's exactly the thing that our God, the one we read about in the scriptures and hear about at synagogue, that's exactly the kind of stuff he does. So, okay, pay attention to what happens next. This is going to be cool. So let me just read the passage to you, because I don't know if I actually read it yesterday as we were working through this again. But we're in Matthew chapter 14. Herod had John the Baptist executed. Jesus was understandably pretty sad about that. Jesus takes a little bit of a hiatus, but everybody's like, hey, hiatus, I don't think so. You have the words of life and the power to command time and space, and I got a bad shoulder, so no, we're going to follow you. And so Jesus goes out in a boat to get away, but he's like, boats sail on water, water's flat, we can see you out there, there's no getting away. And so they chase him down, and they chase him down in mass. This is not like a spontaneous little soiree that pops up. You're talking about 10, 15, maybe 20,000 people who spontaneously track down Jesus. This is like, I'm a Denver Nuggets fan. This is like the Pepsi Center. This is like an NBA basketball capacity crowd appearing out of nowhere. And sometimes I think we forget the magnitude of what's happening here socially as we go along, because we're not adjusting for population inflation. When we think about it, we're like, well, 20,000 people. That's a really, really good turnout, but a good amusement park could pull that off in a day. A good concert, a good food festival in a big city. We are not in a big city, though. We are in the wild hill country, and further, the political and religious authorities who really do control things in this day and age have made it pretty clear that they are not down with what's going on with this Jesus guy. So you got one guy who's basically homeless, just in a boat sailing around, who is being actively opposed by the religious leaders of the day in a very rural area, moving at such a pace across the water that it's going to cost people an entire workday and a lot of energy and time to track him down. And still, this massive crowd gathers. I was about to move on, but I'm not done pounding on this thing. How many of you have Twitter? How many of you have Facebook? Think about how many tweets you've thrown out that have got 20,000 retweets or 20,000 likes. It takes people nothing to like your genius tweet. All they got to do is take their mouse and go up and just click, yeah, I liked it. Or just click, I liked it on the phone. That's it. It's the lowest commitment thing ever. You don't even have to walk anywhere. And think about how rare that is for you or for me. So even with electronic mediation that puts our message in front of the whole world, possibly, and even with the lowest buy-in and commitment that it could possibly take to just even acknowledge our dumb little tweet or post or whatever, we still can't draw 20,000 people spontaneously like this. And Jesus is pulling it off in a time where he had none of those luxuries, none of those advantages. This crowd in and of itself is a mind-boggling commentary on how shocking this moment in history was and how compelling the character of Jesus was. So Jesus just wants to get away. He wants to take a break, but people follow him, and Jesus sees it happening, and instead of just being sad and grouchy that he can't be left alone, instead he has compassion on the crowd. He heals their sick. Matthew 14:15, it says, and as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, it is a remote place, and it's already getting late. You better send the crowds away so they can go to some villages and buy themselves some food. And Jesus replied, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Well, bring them here to me, he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. And taking 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the bread, and then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people, and they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. That's how I'm coming up with my 15,000, 20,000 number. It's just crazy. A worldly king functioning with worldly values and trying to impress people with world kingdom currency would have had this thing catered. He would have planned it all out. There would have been a subtle social media push that would have nudged people toward following Jesus to create the impression of spontaneity, but actually it was a totally orchestrated thing. Surprise, we catered in a bunch of pulled pork. Oh, they wouldn't have done pulled pork. We got a whole bunch of bagels, and he would have given everybody food, and everybody would have been super impressed with how generous and wealthy this worldly king is, but that's not the anatomy here. That is not stacking the deck against yourself. That would be a pre-planned, master-planned event. This doesn't have any of the hallmarks of that. And instead of doing anything like that, Jesus is like, all right, everybody sit down. Looky here what I got. And everybody can see that that's what he's got. That's it. Or at least a lot of the crowd would have been able to see that. There's no way this thing should work. And there's no way a sling with a couple of smooth, small stones should take down an enemy warrior. And there's no way that a completely saturated pile of wood should be able to be burned, let alone consumed with fire from heaven. There's no way that a people group led to the brink of destruction with their backs up against the sea should be able to cross that sea in the face of the most powerful army in the world bearing down on them. All of these moments, and so many more like them, are meant to leave a mark in the cultural memory. They're meant to be so profound and so head-scratching that people will repeat it to their neighbor, who will repeat it to their neighbor, who will repeat it to their neighbor. This is meant to go viral across generations so that later on, another motif that we see in the Bible is that people who remember these things can hearken back to them and be like, all right, so you struggle with doubt. Okay, I get it. But remember, we're talking about the God who did this, and who did this, and who did this, the God who stacks the deck against himself so that nobody else could possibly get credit for this thing. And of course, that pan-biblical motif of God stacking the deck against himself is highlighted in the micro-parables in the first half of the Kingdom Parables discourse in Matthew 13 when Jesus is out in another boat, the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the yeast, but especially the mustard seed, the idea of this little thing growing very, very big in surprising ways. I mean, we're only one page after that here in Matthew 14. How many people just heard that speech with Jesus in a boat another time, and they're like, you know what? This kind of reminds me of that thing. It's like this tiny little bit of food, but it's going to grow up into this much bigger thing that provides shelter and nurturing for this vast number of people. On the surface, the feeding of the 5,000 is obviously a nod to Jesus saying, you don't have to worry because God is the provider. And in the kingdom, provision comes from God. Look, I can feed this gigantic multitude out of effectively nothing to start with. But I think on another parallel wavelength, but perhaps a more subtle one, we get this nod to God's habit of stacking the deck against himself so that when something incredible happens, everybody who was there and everybody they tell, they might not know exactly every detail of what it means, but they can't help but look at it and say, that wasn't some kind of trick. That wasn't some kind of human conquest. Only the supernatural, only God can get credit for that thing. And we're going to break that down a lot further in an upcoming video. Finally, just wanted to say thanks again for everybody who's taken the time to go and review the podcast. That helps so much. There's this little spike and this whole new batch of people who jump in every time literally anybody does that. Reviews are quite the currency in the world of podcasting, apparently, and it just gets put in front of new people every time somebody does it. So thank you very, very much for being willing to vouch for this thing. That is such an honor. That means a tremendous amount to me, and the fact that you're willing to put your name next to mine is not lost on me. That's humbling and awesome of you. Thank you. All right, more fun tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon, my friends.